Well, the question is, well, how would rural voters be spoken to creatively and effectively by the Democratic Party? And as you point out in the question, Barack Obama, president for 8 years. If you actually look at the data, and at the Media Watch Group Fair, the editor of its magazine, Jim Norikis, recently wrote a piece on this. You look on the data of what happened in the U.S. House and U.S. Senate and state legislatures during the 8 years of Bill Clinton's presidency and during the 8 years of Barack Obama's presidency, and it was a wipeout. We hear from the punditocracy how Bill Clinton was this great leader. He was a moderate Democrat, a new Democrat in the jargon of the era. Generally, that's been a positive assessment of Barack Obama. And yet, if, for instance, Barack Obama was such a positive leader with his corporatism that dominated his cabinet and his policies, why during those 8 years did he preside over the decimation of the prospects and the seats of legislators from the 50 state capitals to Capitol Hill here in Washington? And the answer is that largely it was a willingness to let those Democratic candidates who lost fall under the bus, so to speak, because the corporate policies that President Obama was able to implement were very unpopular in the country. And I think this applies to the question here about rural areas, because there's a failure to recognize quite often the tremendous progressive populist history that this country has in rural areas, in the lower southern part of the Midwest, in the upper Midwest. Bob La Follette, Fighting Bob from Wisconsin. We have a history, a heritage of very strong rural populism that has been destroyed, I think, in large measure by the failure of progressives and the Democratic Party to hold firm to basic, genuine populist progressive principles, which has to include fighting the big banks, the oligarchy, and corporations. And our autopsy talks about the need, if the Democratic Party is going to reconnect with people who live in rural areas, the absolute need to, without any equivocation, stand up against big agriculture, the Cargills, the enormous companies that are wreaking such environmental and economic damage in rural areas. And let's not forget that there are programs that can be implemented, like rural broadband, if Democrats would fight more effectively for it and did not do a great job during those 8 years under Obama. It's only because the federally qualified health centers, which are so important in underserved rural areas, were championed by Bernie Sanders, that it got into the Obamacare the ACA final legislation. Bernie made that, if you will, the cost of his vote for Obamacare. He said, these federally qualified health centers are absolutely crucial for people who otherwise will be at the mercy of little or no health care at all. So it comes down to a progressive program, fighting for a progressive program, if rural areas are going to be lived in by people who actually give a damn about the Democratic Party.